Before we begin, a quick insider tip that the Why We Play letter packages will be available for a back-to-school VIP discount soon. These letters are a powerful tool for creating an ongoing discussion about the value of play within your school community. If you want to take advantage of the VIP discount, make sure that you sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter or download the sample letter at notjustcute.com/whyweplay, and you'll be among the first to know when it becomes available. Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Online preschool options are growing in popularity. Just this past spring, TED Talk organizers created a bit of a stir in the early childhood community when they awarded a portion of their audacious project funding to an online preschool company, Waterford Upstart. While proponents suggest this is an affordable and accessible option for families that may not otherwise have preschool options, detractors say the most valuable parts of preschool could never be packaged into a virtual program. Even before this brouhaha boiled over, Amy Webb was writing about the misconceptions surrounding online preschool on her site, The Thoughtful Parent. I'm so excited to have her join me on today's episode to break this topic down. You can find show notes for this episode at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 25. Amy brings some fantastic insight into this conversation on online preschools. I am so excited for you to get to know her, so let's jump right in. Hi, Amy. I'm so excited to have you join us on this conversation today.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So before we jump into this hot topic, I wanted to first get people familiar with you, people who maybe haven't read what you have so far. If you tell a little bit about who you are and where you write and what your background is.
Okay. Well, I am a blogger. I have a blog called The Thoughtful Parent. That blog came out of my background in human development and family sciences. And as I was finishing up my degree, I kind of realized there's all this wonderful parenting research that's in academic journals that parents rarely see. And so my goal with the blog is to try to bring some of that research into parents' lives in kind of a friendly way that can maybe help them inform their decision making. And also I'm a mom, of course, of two little boys who are 9 and 6. And so I've been staying at home with them for the past basically 9 years. And so the blog is my way of keeping my brain active and keeping up with the world of child development.
I love that. And we've talked before about how we share that common passion, just like you said, that there's so much fascinating information and that it really needs to get to the people who really are using it every single day with kids. And so I love that you share that same passion. And I do want to point out, you're so humble. You mentioned just finishing up your degree. And this was actually a doctoral degree, not just your undergrad degree, but your doctoral degree, correct?
Yes, that's true. I have a doctorate in human development and family sciences. And so that, again, that's where this passion for the field comes from and trying to get that research into the hands of parents.
Yeah. And I love that you bring all that research background that I know you have a really strong background in and share that. So I wanted to jump in. I'm so glad that you're here for this conversation because it's exactly what you just talked about, taking the research and really getting down to what is most important and getting it to the people that need to know. So there's this hot topic right now about online preschool and whether or not that is the best, most efficient, most cost-effective way to reach children universally, right? To give them this preschool experience. And you wrote about this recently. And so I thought that you might start out by just kind of sharing your Cliff Note versions of what you wrote about. What are some of the misconceptions that surround this idea of online preschool?
Yeah, so I heard about this issue of online preschools a few months ago through an NPR story, and I was honestly a little shocked to hear this was the way that education was moving, or at least some of it. So I think probably the biggest misconception to my mind around this idea of online preschool is the idea that academic skills are all kids need to be prepared for kindergarten. If we just give them this content, and then they'll be ready to go for kindergarten. And I think, the underlying misconception there is that it's just about academics. It's not about any other part of their development. And so that is one reason I was very interested in this idea, because I think that we know from the research and, from everything that we know about child development is kids need very full educational experiences that tap into all aspects of their development, not just academics, to really be prepared for kindergarten and future schooling. And so that includes, the physical aspect of their development through play and, exercise, and as well as the social emotional part of their development, which I think is, from what I can tell, totally overlooked in this idea of an online preschool. So I think that kind of gets to, what is the underlying misconceptions about online preschools, that it's just about academics. And that's just not what we know from the research to be true.
Right. And I think that's so big and so important that, just like you said, that it's not just about the academics. And in particular, as you mentioned, the social emotional aspect. I mean, the research that I'm familiar with, and maybe you can share your own experience, I've seen more research that says social emotional skills in those early childhood years are much more predictive of long-term outcomes than is their academic standing at that point. Is that what you've seen as well?
Exactly. I mean, that's what we're seeing over and over again is, I think it comes down to sort of, we often underestimate what kids are really capable of at this age. And, learning ABCs and numbers is important, but they can do so much more than that. And so the social emotional piece of that is really what they're needing to focus on at these young ages is, how can they get along with their friends and learn about self-regulation and how to control their emotions. Those things are in some ways much harder for them to learn with very young, immature brains. And that's really what we need to help them focus on those early years, because the ABCs and the numbers will come, and they will need to know those things, of course, but the social emotional aspect of it is really so much a higher priority at these young ages.
And sometimes I wonder if it's just that it's so much harder to measure social emotional skills, right? So it's so easy for us to sit down and say, tell me your ABCs, check the box. He's learning. He's great. He's on track. And, it's one of those things that you value what you measure, and you measure the things that are easy. And so that's the thing that gets the emphasis and the value. But like you mentioned, like we've been talking about, that the research tells us it's the social emotional. And while that's harder to conceptualize and harder to measure and harder, to do all of those things, it actually is more valuable. And so just like you said, I worry that it's overlooked. It's not given enough attention. And just like you said, this whole topic kind of hinges on this idea, this misconception that it's really just about the academic aspect and closing the gap in academics and neglecting the other parts of the whole child. And that's a dangerous assumption.
Yes, I think you're totally right. Exactly. Your point about this more subtle aspect of social emotional development. It's so much harder to measure and to see. And so it's so much easier just to focus on the academics, and we know we can measure that and we can see how kids are progressing. I think that's a great point.
So one of the reasons, I think this has been a hot topic for a while anyway, just because it's growing in popularity, this concept of online preschool. One of the reasons I've seen it popping up a lot recently is because of the TED funding through the Audacious Project, and that a portion of this funding went to the Upstart program, which is part of an online preschool plan. And there's been a lot of people that are upset and concerned about that, as well as just the fact that these types of programs are getting government funding, right? That they feel like it's taking a portion of this early education funding is going to this online concept. But the argument from the Upstart side of things, or for anyone who's supporting online preschool, the argument is, a lot of this is to help children who are in rural or underprivileged or underfunded areas who would not get in-person preschool. They would not get, there it just isn't funding for a building and faculty and staff and full scale preschool. And so they're saying this is a great option. It's efficient. It's effective by our measures, right? And we can give this to children who otherwise would have nothing. So they're saying, we can give them nothing or we can give them this. Isn't this a great option? So from that perspective, this idea that specifically with Upstart, they're saying it's a 15-minute a day program, and that those 15 minutes are better than nothing. So what do I love to look at both sides of an argument. I tell people that if you can't see the opposition's perspective, then you don't understand it well enough to argue against it, right? You need to at least understand it. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you think they're getting right? And what do you think is missing the mark with this concept that online preschool could at least be helpful to kids who otherwise would have nothing?
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to look at kind of the other side. I think what they're getting right is this focus on closing the gap. I mean, that we know in education is a huge issue, and anything we can do to address, these more disadvantaged populations, low income, rural students who don't have access to other educational opportunities. So I think the focus on this issue is great, and it's very necessary. We need to be focusing on problems or solutions to this problem of inequality, and how kids across the country have vastly different educational opportunities depending on where you live and what your income is. And so I think the focus on that is a good one. And also this idea that maybe we can partner, private and public funding together. That I think is an optimistic idea too, that, state funding, federal funding for education continues to drop, and it continues to be a problem across the country. So I think the problem solving techniques of, okay, let's partner maybe with some private funders and things like that can be a really, great way to help tackle this problem. So just in the general idea, I think is great. Where they miss the mark again, I think is relying too much on technology as the solution for all of the problem. We know from research that children in low income and rural situations, especially low income situations, are exposed to screens a lot more than their counterparts to begin with. And so, this focus on more and more technology as the solution to this issue, I think is pretty short-sighted, because that is kind of already a problem in many cases, too much screen time and not enough active play. And so I think that's where things have maybe gone awry a little bit. And also just, as I said before, focusing so much on just academics and not the fuller educational experience, which is really what is going to close the gap. I mean, just focusing on academics in and of itself, I don't think is going to solve this larger problem of, the gap that we see between low income students and their counterparts. We have to give low income students, disadvantaged students, a more full educational opportunity, which is really what their, more advantaged counterparts have. They have access to all these other opportunities, hands-on learning and, free play and all these resources that the disadvantaged kids don't have. And so just throwing technology at the problem, I don't think is the best approach.
I think you hit on so many really important points right there. It's important for us to pay attention to that inequality and to work to close the gap. But just like you pointed out, the gap isn't just in academic skills. The gap, they're talking now about a play gap that exists, that children are getting less play. And like you mentioned, as you mentioned, that some of those disadvantaged populations have more screen time, and that actually correlates also with, this discussion about a play gap, that those populations also tend to have less free play time. And whether that's, I know one of the statistics points to even within their schools. So their school setting gives them less time for recess, whether that's a safety issue or it's because, like you said, we're so focused on closing this academic gap that we're saying, well, these kids don't have time to play, right? So we're going to just drill and try to close the gap. And we're forgetting that the academics are not the only gap, and that the way to fill that gap is not necessarily done best by drilling down, right? That it's part of part of what they're missing is all of these other experiences and the play and the fullness, just like you said, to give them the full advantage. That the gap between advantage and disadvantage is not just about who learns their ABCs the earliest, right?
Right.
It really is kind of a superficial perspective to say we're going to close this gap by, making sure that we can check these boxes at the same time. And like you mentioned, that if we're going to talk about equality, trying to lessen the educational inequality that we have, and we compare what this solution offers versus what we're giving, or what advantage populations are receiving, it really doesn't match up. And I think that's one of the arguments that I read in several places, particularly from Defending the Early Years. I think they point out, would any of these people who are promoting this as a way to close this inequality gap, would any of them feel good about giving their children 15 minutes a day of online preschool instead of, these great programs that they're sending their children to, and saying none of these people would choose that for their own children. And so why are we offering that as our best solution, right?
Exactly.
So I think part of what makes this so controversial is not just this question of whether or not children can learn from these 15 minutes, because that's one of the arguments, saying it is effective. We've done tests, and children who spend 15 minutes a day doing these programs, they do show earlier literacy skills, and they do show growth, and they do show progress in these things that we're measuring, right? And so I don't even think that that's a point of argument, right? The question isn't, is it effective in those terms, right? The question isn't, can they learn some of these skills in those 15 minutes? But I think what the opposition to these programs is saying is we really need to rethink our priorities. Like you've been saying, is that how we want to measure growth and service to our early years populations? Do we want to measure it only by these small, finite academic skills, right? And we have to look at those priorities all over again and question whether or not academic tasks are really the most important things that we can invest our time and our money into. So I'm curious what you think. We've talked a little bit about this, but particularly when we're talking about better serving our disadvantaged populations, what do you feel like these children really need? So let's say a philanthropist walks in and hands you a bunch of money, right? And access to all kinds of things in your perfect world, which I know that's the challenge, right? We don't have that perfect world. But if we start there and then find out what we can do, I'm curious, if you were given that opportunity to say, what would you do to help disadvantaged children close up the gap, not just the achievement gap, but the play gap and just the access? So what do you feel like those populations really need? If it's not 15 minutes a day of online preschool, what do you feel like they really need?
Wow, that's a great question. So I think just looking at the bigger picture of child development and how kids really learn in those early years, I think I would point to a lot of time in nature and how can we bring nature to them in such a way that it sparks their learning. And so I know that obviously is a challenge because many areas are very urban and have very little exposure to nature, but bringing kids out in nature to help them understand, the beauty of the natural world and help them really provide that all sensory learning experience. They're learning not just with their minds, but they're touching, they're smelling, they're feeling, they're running around. And so I think something like that would provide such a more fuller educational experience for kids who are in a disadvantaged situation. And also, research talks a lot about guided play and the role that play can be in our educational system. And so I think sometimes people think of that as just like kids running around chaotic and it's just crazy. What are they learning from that? But, if you ever see, and you know this from all the writing and work that you do, that if you ever witness a really high quality educational program that involves guided play and a really caring adult who's helping kids learn through play, it's really a lovely thing to see. And I think if some of these folks who are funding this online preschool would had the exposure to that kind of situation and see what kids learn through that type of situation, I think they would see the folly in what online preschools are trying to do, because put into a situation with a teacher who can ask the right questions and kind of guide them through a situation where they're learning through playing grocery store or playing doctor's office or something like that. Those really rich learning experiences that can happen in preschool. I think people would really have their eyes open to what that kind of educational experience really does for kids. So if I, had all the money in the world, that's the type of program I would set up, would be something that involved a lot of outdoor time, a lot of guided play, and, caring adults that really nurture kids' sense of curiosity. So something like that, that's obviously an ideal world, and it's very challenging to get to that point in a lot of situations, not just disadvantaged situations, but those to me are the fullest learning experiences that young children can have. So something like that scenario would be ideal in my world.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really, really important point that we haven't talked about yet. When you say that one of the most valuable things that they could use in that type of a scenario that you just described, that in that guided play scenario, one of the most valuable assets they have is a caring adult who interacts and questions and guides. And it just brought to mind all the things that I've read about the importance of interactions and responsiveness, and that the marker of a high quality early education program, really one of the top markers is the types of interactions that they have, how the teachers talk with the children, how they respond to them, and how they have the back and forth, right? The serve and return, and how crucial that is, particularly in the early years and in the developmental process and in the learning process, that it has to be this responsive back and forth. And that's another thing that I would imagine is completely missing from an online experience, because you can't have an authentic, emotional, responsive back and forth, right? With technology in and of itself. There's some great algorithms out there, and there's a lot of things that they can do, but it's just never going to replace the back and forth human experience, right? That we are, exactly. Human development is predicated upon human relationships. That's just, I think, a truth that we can't escape. And so that importance of interactions in that guided play scenario, the serve and return, the relationships, I think that's another element that in general, again, not just to this topic of online preschool, but in general, we're undervaluing how crucial and powerful those are. And maybe, again, it's similar to the social and emotional discussion that we had, that it's hard to measure. It's hard to, you can't script it out, because that's antithetical to the whole process, right? Yeah. We can't script it. We can't really precisely measure. In fact, that's one of the things I mentioned before when I was talking about, it was the position statement that came from the Brookings Institution about what do we know from the research on early childhood. They got together for this consensus statement. And I found it really interesting that you get a bunch of scientists together who are examining, how do we control for these variables, and what are the outcomes, and what do we know? And one of the biggest findings they had was our most effective element is this thing we can't control, right? Yeah, it's the interactions, it's the back and forth. And I just think that it's powerful, and it's overlooked again in this whole perspective of early childhood education in general, but also in particular, when we look at online preschools, we're missing that element of human interaction back and forth. And that's what human development is predicated on. And I've wondered sometimes, and I do believe, in particular, the Upstart program, I haven't used the program. I haven't looked at it in depth, but the descriptions that I've read, it does sound like they do have an element of parent education in it as well. And I've thought, I wonder if we could do more good with training the adults with online programs and teach them how to interact with the children. So instead of putting the kids in front of the computer for 15 minutes a day, let's put the parents in front of the computer for a little bit of time to learn, why it's important, and how do you support and guide play, and how do you have powerful interactions. And I'm curious if we would find more good from that than we would sitting
that's
down and drilling academic.
Yeah,
facts.
Exactly. And I've seen studies, not in an online situation, but where they've done parent training or parent coaching in a lab setting, and that's exactly what they find. If you can kind of coach parents that may not be aware of the value of play and, kind of that questioning process that helps that take their kids' learning to the next level. And it's really pretty simple, but yeah, exactly. If you can teach parents that would be so much more valuable, I think, than any sort of online program for the children. That's a great point. Exactly.
Oh, Amy, I've loved discussing this with you, and I appreciate all the perspectives that you brought with this. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed talking about it.
I wanted to share with you one interesting note that came up after we ended the official recording. It turns out that Amy and I actually both grew up in rural areas, in economically stable homes ourselves, but in low-income areas overall. There's an increased personal connection for us on this topic. When we read about how these programs can serve rural, low-income areas, those are our communities they're talking about. And neither one of us wants that for our hometown. Interestingly, we have both watched in recent years as our hometowns have incorporated quality early childhood programs and made them accessible for the community. As Amy said, as we talked about this, it's just evidence that there is another option out there, one that will better serve children and communities. I'm confident that the online preschool options are being pursued with the best of intentions. I just don't think it's the best place to put our energy and our resources for serving the children we love and teach. Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 25. You'll find links to Amy's article along with other interesting tidbits that we discussed. You'll also find out how to make sure you hear about the back to school VIP discount on the Why We Play letters coming up very soon. So be sure to head over and sign up. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com and follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.